Okay, now on to explaining those educational outcomes, looking at cultural factors. Um, these are a group of sociologists who go against the idea of financial or money being the key reason why working class uh, people or students or people from working class background do worse in the education system. These guys were mainly writing in the 1960s, somewhat old fashioned in their views, shall we say. And essentially, one of the main criticisms of them, they blame working class people for having working class culture and then therefore sabotaging themselves when it comes to the education system. Um, Carl Bayreuther and Basil Bernstein uh, even got to the point of suggesting that working class culture is deficient, they're cultural deprivation theorists, and that they see that the use of language is not sufficient to access education. And what they're saying is things like working class people tend to communicate with simple gestures, um, grammatically uncomplex construction of sentences. Meaning is specific to the context, not standalone. Um, and in this way, Basil Bernstein, and help with the Thesaurus birds, talks about working class people having a restrictive code in it, shouldn't, not being able to articulate the meanings being lost outside the cultural context in which they're spoken, um, as opposed to middle class codes of contact, forms, codes of speech, which are elaborative, standalone. It's like comparing the Sun to the Guardian. It's saying that the way they speak and the way their mind works restricts them in terms of educational achievement. Douglas, writing in the late 60s, blames working class parents' attitudes in general, not pro school, not pro education, and so this reflects in the way that they bring up their children. He did a study sitting in a school, seeing what type of parents turned up to a parents' evening. I don't know how he did it, but he came to the conclusion that middle class parents are more likely to go to parents' evening than working class parents, indicating a lack of the cultural good stuff, the emphasis on what's needed in this way. Similarly, parental styles are argued as a cause for working class underachievement in education. In other words, again, it's that way of blaming the parent, blaming the victim, I would call it, which is this idea that middle class parents are able to articulate and to converse with their children, explain at length, whereas working class parents simply are reduced to do as I say because I told you so, which does not help their development, or at least this is what these guys argue. In the same way, they suggest, and again, this is Bernstein, that middle class folk buy educational toys for their kids, whereas working class folk waste that opportunity and buy the wrong things like Xbox and games and things like that. Again, blaming the victim, looking to say that there are cultural deficiencies. Barry Kugelman took this further and put the blame squarely on working class culture for preventing barriers to educational achievement. And he specifically talked about a fatalistic attitude, that is, why work today when we might be dead tomorrow, that kind of thing. The idea that individuality is less important than the collective image. So like a football fan or a group of lads, the group is more important than the individual identity, and that this will affect. it is said that, for instance, in North America, in Native American classes, the idea of putting your hand up when answering a question does not work. They have to work in a different way, because in the native culture, you wouldn't put your hand up to get a question right, because it would show your fellows that they didn't know, and that there would be shame involved in shaming others that did not know. So there are different cultural attitudes, and this is, again, not something I personally would hold to. And when we come onto the material deprivation theorists, you'll see why. But this idea of standing out from the crowd, this lack of wanting to invest their mortgage the present for the future is a way of looking at it. So invest in education, stay in education, do your time in education, and then, having spent 6 years, 7 years at university, qualify as a doctor. It suggests that this is a middle class aspiration, in that they are uniquely, it would seem, able to forgo the now for the better in the future, whereas working class folks like Homer Simpson here want everything now and are unable to defer immediate gratification in terms of educational outcomes. And this boils up, and really where we're going to with this is the idea that there is a kind of real-time orientation. Only the here and now matters to working class people. And again, this is, something I have to say I don't go with, but that would be a cultural explanation for why working class folks do not do it as well in our education system. A similar set of ideas are prevalent when it comes to looking at why certain ethnic minorities don't do so well. And people like Basil Bernstein have suggested that people from Afro-Caribbean backgrounds, for instance, as well as Asian backgrounds, lack the linguistic skills, have across culture, because the culture at home does not mix the culture at school, and that there are cultural barriers in terms of language, which, although, as Heidi Mirza has pointed out, that wouldn't explain quite why Asian families do it as well as they do. Asian students, so those from the Indian subcontinent, do as well as they do, if it's linguistic ability that is key here. Also, the Swan report showed that this is not true, basically, and that the home language has little or no influence on educational outcomes. And we go on to the likes of Charles Murray. We remember Charles Murray, that horrible, sociologist from the New Right. He goes to say that because there's a higher prevalence of lone parenthood amongst Afro-Caribbean families in particular, that there is an absence of male role models for young growing up Black lads, and this would explain their lack of attainment in school. And Charles Murray would also go on to say that this would explain high rates of criminality. Again, I'm sorry, I have to say that that is clearly nonsense. Going on to the gender explanation. So the cultural explanation for Black underachievement, just to add to that, is the idea that they're culturally deficient. The gender aspect of this is that culture may explain why girls do better than boys at GCSE, and what sociologists such as Angela McRobbie have pointed out, that when she did a study of the Jackie, this is back in the 70s, and compared to what girls were talking about in the Jackie in the 1970s on the problem page, and what issues were dealt with on the problem pages of Jackie in the 1990s. There was a clear swap between the attitudes of those who in the 70s had prioritized getting a man, getting married, and finding wealth and status in that way, compared to the 1990s, where girls were far more career oriented. And this would also explain why they do so much better in schools. Sue Sharp, a very similar set of ideas in the sense that she did a study amongst girls, not looking at a magazine, but interviewing groups of girls in the 1970s and the 1990s. And the results are echoed in the way of their concerns switching and becoming more career oriented and goal oriented. Ironically, I suppose, it has been pointed out by some feminist writers that the amount of the increase of lone parent families, or particularly female-headed families, might explain why girls do better than boys, because girls are growing up in an environment where they see the breadwinner as their mother. They see that in this world, you have to get qualifications if you want to be secure. Divorce rates are going to do that. They also suggest, and there is something in the fact that the biggest gap between female and male achievement is in the Afro-Caribbean community, where, relatively speaking, not compared to the average entirely, that Black girls do much better than Black boys. And this is that idea that because there is a high prevalence of single or lone-headed families, particularly female lone-headed families, that this might explain that phenomena.